Welcome to Time of Death. This video is for informational purposes and in no way meant to glorify or condone violence. In today's video, we'll be discussing the murder of Rodolfo Macias. Macias was shot and killed on Sunday, December 28, 2008, in the 500 block of Mar Vista Avenue in Pasadena, according to LA County Coroner records. Jose Arnau, Thomas Carrillo Ramirez, and Dario Daniel Ramirez were subsequently arrested and charged with the murder. The following is the evidence at trial. A little before 2:30 a.m. on December 28, 2008, victim Rodolfo Macias was fatally shot 4 times from behind, with 3 other shots entering the back of his head and 1 entering his upper back. Mr. Salcedo was also shot in the face and lost his left eye, but survived. He had no memory of what happened to him. The victim and Salcedo were shot at the conclusion of a confrontation with members of the Pasadena Latin Kings. Mr. Salcedo lived with Mr. Galvez on Mar Vista Avenue in Pasadena. On the evening of December 27th, Mr. Galvez held a backyard barbecue attended by Mr. Salcedo, the victim, and Mr. Nava, who lived down the street. None of the 4 were gang members, but Mr. Salcedo and the victim had shaved heads and may have looked like gang members. Mr. Nava arrived around midnight. At some point, the victim borrowed Mr. Nava's mobile phone and walked out to the street with Mr. Salcedo. 10 or 20 minutes later, Nava was concerned about getting his phone back, so he and Mr. Galvez walked out to the sidewalk at the end of Galvez's driveway. They saw the victim and Salcedo on the sidewalk 3 to 5 houses away. As Galvez and Nava stood waiting for the victim and Salcedo to return, they saw a dark blue Jeep Liberty drive by slowly toward them. It stopped in front of Galvez's driveway. At trial, Galvez and Nava identified defendant Thomas as the driver of the Jeep and defendant Dario as his front seat passenger. A younger, thinner, clean-shaven man was in the back seat, and both Galvez and Nava had previously identified photographs of defendant Jose Arnau as depicting the backseat passenger. Defendants Thomas and Dario asked Galvez and Nava where they were from, which Galvez and Nava understood as an inquiry regarding gang affiliation. Both Galvez and Nava replied nowhere. Nava testified that he then added that he had nothing to do with you guys. You guys could leave now. You already did what you had to do. Galvez testified that Nava said, just let it be. Defendant Thomas became agitated and said, you think I'm gonna leave this like that? Thomas and Dario got out of the Jeep and approached Galvez and Nava. Galvez testified that defendants Thomas and Dario said Pasadena Latin Kings and PLK, and again asked where Galvez and Nava were from. Nava testified that Thomas again asked, do you think I'm gonna leave that like that? Nava replied, do whatever you want, I'm not gonna do nothing. If anything, you're gonna punch me, I'll punch you back. Galvez and Nava both testified that they had been hit up by gang members on numerous prior occasions and no violence had ensued. Mr. Salcedo and the victim then began walking or running towards Thomas, Dario, Galvez, and Nava. Defendants Dario and Thomas turned away from Galvez and Nava and walked up to Salcedo and the victim and asked where they were from. Salcedo responded by shrugging his shoulders and shaking his head. Galvez testified that defendants stood on either side of the victim and grabbed and held his shoulders. Defendant Arnau then got out of the Jeep, walked behind Salcedo, pointed a gun at Salcedo's head, and fired. Salcedo fell to the ground. Defendants Thomas and Dario held onto the victim, who struggled to get away from them. Galvez began to run back to his home and heard but did not see the victim get shot. Nava testified that the driver pushed Salcedo, then shot him point blank in the eye. After Salcedo fell, the passenger grabbed the victim's sweater and began shoving him in the chest while holding onto him. Nava did not remember seeing the victim get shot. According to Nava, the backseat passenger never got out of the Jeep. Nava ran back to Galvez's house. Nava testified he saw the man get back into the Jeep, and Galvez testified he saw the Jeep drive away with 3 men inside. The victim was mortally wounded. Pasadena Police Detective Keith Gomez began surveillance of defendant Thomas's home on the morning of December 28. At about 11 a.m., Thomas walked out to a blue Jeep Liberty parked on the street. He sat in the front passenger seat and reached into the rear seat where he grabbed a dark plaid Pendleton-type shirt. After looking up and down the street, he walked around to the side of the porch. Defendant Dario came outside and handed Thomas a clear plastic bag containing dark clothing. Thomas took the bag and threw it next to some garbage. The police detained Thomas and Dario and searched the house. They found no guns, ammunition, or drugs. They recovered the clear plastic bag, inside of which was a Pendleton-type shirt that appeared to be the same one Detective Gomez saw Thomas remove from the Jeep. Mr. Galvez identified the Pendleton-type shirt recovered from the trash outside of Thomas's house as the one the defendant Arnau wore during the shooting. Mr. Nava also identified this shirt, but was unsure whether the front seat passenger or the driver wore it. The shirt had a blood stain on it that contained a mixture of two contributors' DNA. The major contributor matched the victim's profile, and defendant Arnau was a possible minor contributor. Defendant Thomas and Mr. Salcedo were excluded as the minor contributor, but defendant Dario could neither be included or excluded. A swath on the shirt's collar had a mixture of three contributors. Defendant Arnau and the victim were possible contributors. Defendant Thomas and Mr. Salcedo were excluded as the minor contributor, but defendant Dario could neither be included or excluded. Defendants Thomas and Dario each made several statements to the police. The police interviewed Dario 3 times on December 28. The first time, he claimed he was no longer active in the gang and denied both knowledge of the shooting and being in the blue Jeep. In the second interview, Dario admitted being in the blue Jeep and said he had heard about a fatal shooting, but said he had been dropped off at home before the shooting. In the third interview, defendant Dario admitted he was at the scene of the shooting, but initially claimed he didn't see it occur because he was drunk and lying in the back seat. Then he admitted he saw defendant Arnau shoot the two men, but claimed he stayed inside the Jeep the entire time. The police interviewed defendant Thomas late at night on December 28, then again around midnight, and a third time around 5 p.m. on December 29th. In the first interview, Thomas admitted driving his mother's blue Jeep Liberty on the night of December 27, but denied being at the scene of the shootings. He said he had gone to his friend Toro's house and returned around 10:30 or 11 p.m. In the third interview, Thomas said he messed up and should not have talked shit to these guys, meaning the two men he originally hit up. He said he heard a gunshot, then got back in the Jeep and drove to defendant Arnau's house. He was upset with Arnau and asked him, "What did you do?" Later, Thomas admitted that he was the one who decided to stop the Jeep on Mar Vista and talk shit to the two men by asking them where they were from. The prosecution's gang expert, Officer Andrea Perez, testified that most of the Latino gangs in Pasadena do not have fixed territories, but in December of 2008, Mr. Galvez's home was in the area claimed by the Villa Boys, which is an enemy of the Pasadena Latin Kings. Officer Perez testified that gang members put in work by committing crimes for the gang, and they do so to prove their allegiance to the gang and to earn respect within the gang. In response to the prosecutor's detailed hypothetical question based on the prosecution's evidence at trial, Officer Perez opined that the shooting described in question would be an example of putting in work and would have been committed for the benefit of the Pasadena Latin Kings. Defendant Thomas was tried with defendant Arnau using separate juries. Arnau was convicted of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and mayhem with gun and gang enhancements, but Thomas's jury could not reach a verdict. During the second trial, defendants Thomas and Dario were tried together with a single jury. The jury convicted Thomas and Dario of second-degree murder, attempted voluntary manslaughter, and mayhem. The court sentenced each defendant to a term of 69 years to life in state prison. Rodolfo Macias was 27 years old at the time of death.